Thank you. Circumstantial evidence is like a rope, and each fact is a strand of that rope, and as the prosecution piles one fact upon another, we add strands and we add strength to that rope, but if one strand is break, the rope is not broken. The strength of the rope is barely diminished. Why? Because there are so many other strands of almost steel-like strength that the rope is still more than strong enough to bind this defendant to just...
It's a misstatement of the law.
He's not even stating it. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, let me just say this. One of the instructions you're going to get is that my instructions are what you follow. If the attorneys in any way have a different interpretation of law, it doesn't make any difference because you follow my instructions. And I find this just to be a point. It's an analogy, and since my instructions will control, we may proceed.
Thank you.
All right?
The strength of that rope is still more than strong enough to bind this defendant to justice. That's what circumstantial evidence is all about. And what we have in this case is more than 20 strands of rope, and Mr. Dameron went through those with you in detail, and we'll touch on those in a moment as well. All the similarities in this case, that's all circumstantial evidence that's very, very powerful. Let's talk about Ashley Ellerin. We'll try to take this sort of in order of how the argument came up yesterday when Mr. Nardoni was arguing, and I'll try to take, I won't take all of his points, but I'll take most of the ones that seem to be most important. We'll talk about them now. Ashley Ellerin, the big issue that comes up with Ashley Ellerin is Mark Durban did it. That's the third-party culpability term that we heard come up with, and there may be evidence that some other person did that. Well, the defense is doing what we see is called, some other guy did it defense. And that's what they're doing here. They're accusing Mark Durban of murdering Ashley Ellerin. Let's look at some facts now that show clearly all the evidence points to Mr. Gargiulo. In order to think that Mr. Durban did this, you would have to ignore all the evidence as to Mr. Gargiulo. But let's look at some of the facts that we know about Mark Durban. The defense is saying Mark Durban killed Ashley Ellerin. You watched Mark Durban testify from this stand. Here's what we know. Mark Durban had absolutely no motive to harm Ashley. He loved Ashley. There was no physical evidence connecting him with the harm of Ashley. No DNA. He was totally cooperative with the police at all stages of the investigation, unlike Mr. Gargiulo. When they tried to get Mr. Gargiulo's DNA, he bolted. It took 4 police officers to tackle him. Here, Mr. Durban, totally cooperative. That's an inference of, hey, I'm an open book. Come talk to me. I'll help you the best I can. It's a mark of honesty. He consented to the search of his home. He consented to the search of his cars. He consented to giving his DNA. He called Ashley repeatedly after he left Ashley's house. How did the police know that Mark Durban took a shower and took out the trash, which Mr. Nardoni argued yesterday? How did they know that? Mark told them. Why would Mark admit something that he thought was incriminating? He said, I took out the trash and took a shower. So Mark told them. That bears on his credibility. He's telling the police things they would not have known. He was cross-examined for hours. You watched him on the stand. You'll see the jury instruction on how to evaluate the testimony of witnesses, and it includes a lot of different things, and you'll see those jury instructions on all the different factors you look at. And it's you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, watching body language. How responsive is that witness to questioning? How honest do you think they are? It's your common experience as jurors. You look at somebody and go, is this person telling the truth to me or not? You know when somebody's telling the truth. And that common experience that you have in applying the law, of watching somebody and evaluating them and their body language and how they're answering questions. Are they direct? Are they responsive? Those are factors you can look at in evaluating credibility. And that's what Mark Durban did over hours and I think days. He was hammered on cross-examination, and the defense didn't score any points with him other than making him cry. So the mark of honesty came from Mr. Durban when he was on the stand. You watched him. You watched him testify. Another way of putting that is his demeanor, character, and quality of his testimony was credible, responsive, cooperative, and emotional. Another factor, how did the police know he had sex with Ashley that day? He told them. The police would not have known that. Again, he's telling the police things they don't know, something that could possibly incriminate him. for whatever reason. The police are trying to solve a murder. He's telling the police things they wouldn't know. It has the mark of honesty. It bears the mark of honesty on it. And we're going to see that again when we talk about Herman Bruno. Admitting things to police that they don't know is a big factor when you're assessing that person's credibility. Let's look at Mark Durban. The defense brought up yesterday that Mark had a scratch on his arm. Oh, he's got a scratch on his arm. He must have been in some sort of altercation with Ashley. What we know from the evidence in this case, and the transcripts on the screen now, we know that Ms. Elleren's, we heard a lot about fingernails and fingernail DNA, and I think we're all probably experts in it now, but Ashley Elleren's fingernails were tested and swabbed for DNA. So it stands to reason that if Ashley had been in some sort of altercation with Mark, which is a totally unreasonable interpretation of the evidence, that Ashley would have had DNA under her nails. And we know from the detectives that Ms. Elleren's fingernails were swabbed and they didn't have any DNA on there except for Ms. Elleren. So it stands to reason that if Ashley would have scratched Mark, his DNA would have been on or under her fingernails. We don't have that. So this exonerates Mr. Durban. Ultimately, at the end of very long testimony from Mr. Durban, I asked him, did you kill Ashley? And he denied it. With regard to the chronology that Mr. Nardoni came up with yesterday, we're dealing with a situation of minutes here. We're dealing with estimated times that we're trying to remember. And Mr. Nardoni set up a chronology of how the night that Ms. Elleren was murdered. And here's what we're dealing with here. We have estimated times as testified to the witnesses years later. Ashton Kutcher was spot on with his time because he happened to have his phone, and it was 8:24. So we know 8:24 is a reliable time that we can work with. Beyond that, and if you can go through the testimony of the witnesses, they're all over the map with times. They're estimate. What time did you leave? What time? 8:15. They're all estimates. So we're not dealing with precision here. We're dealing with estimates. The defense would have you believe that everything has to be. We're down to the second. We're dealing in human affairs here, right? If you ask, exactly what time did you leave this courtroom yesterday, you may not be able to give us the exact moment, but you can give us an estimate. That's fair. That's reasonable. Well, that's what we have when we're dealing with this timeline here. You need to look at it through the lens of witnesses who are estimating times years later or sometime later and trying to remember back when the times are. So keep that in mind. They set up a timeline where there's simply not enough time for Mr. Durban to have committed this murder with these injuries in the time period suggested. At 8:24, Ashley was alive. Ashley was on the phone with Ashton Kutcher and had just gotten out of the shower. And what we know is Todd Jackson at that park he's in the park at around that time, but he's not seeing anybody. You would think that if Mark Durban had murdered Ashley and ran out of the house, that Todd would have seen him. Todd doesn't see anybody. And Mark says that he left as early as maybe 8. He may have left at 8. Could have been 8:15. At one point, it said 8:30. But what we do know from Mark was that he was trying to get home. He had to get home by 8:30 for sure because his girlfriend, Nicole Harlan, and he was hiding his relationship with Ashley from Nicole. She was coming home. He had time pressure to get home by 8:30. So if we've got Mark with time pressure to get home by 8:30, and you were there, it's a short walk from Ashley's house over to Mark's apartment. There simply isn't enough time. There isn't enough time, even if you accept the timeline the defense is giving you, there is not enough time for Mark Durban to commit this crime and get home. There just isn't enough time. When you look at Ashley's body and what was done to her by Mr. Gargiulo, 47 stab wounds, and what was done to her, that takes some time to do that. There simply is not a big enough window of time frame for Mark Durban to have committed this, even under the best of interpretations of this timeline. So keep an eye on Gargiulo's diabolical plan to slip in behind the boyfriend husband, because that's what we're arguing in this case, is Mr. Gargiulo is so sophisticated and he's watching real-time information, and he picks those perfect opportunities to slip in right behind and kill. That's what he did here, and we're about ready to see it, what he did 4 years later with Irving and Maria Bruno. That's what he does when we're talking about a predator and a calculating, sophisticated serial killer. He's watching, and when he sees somebody leave, he's right in behind him. What better way to shift blame to somebody else? He's that good. So keep an eye on that. With regard to Mark Durban and his times, he gives different times. He's trying to estimate. He's being helpful. What he tells us, and you can look at these transcripts and have this read back if you like, but some of it is, did you expect her to be home at 8:30, referring to his girlfriend? I believe it was 8:30 was the time, and that was why the urgency to leave. Can you give us an approximation of the time it was that you walked in the door of your apartment? Can you ballpark it for us? That would have been within, 5 minutes of when I left, so between 8:15 and 8:30. So the defense would have you believe that 8:24 is the operative moment, and then after that, Todd Jackson's hearing screams, and it must have been then. Mark Durban doesn't know. It could have been 8, it could have been 8:15, it could have been 8:30. So that's what he testified to. And he goes on, he says, we asked him, well, your urgency to leave was because you thought your girlfriend was coming home at 8:30, yes. And in fact, she was going to be parking her vehicle in that parking lot right next to the house. You saw that when we were out there. Right next to Ashley's house is that parking lot. That's where Nicole was going to park. And Mark would have had to walk right by that parking lot. And so it was, whatever your relationship was with Ms. Ellerin, you were keeping it secret from your girlfriend, yes. So he's got to get home. He has to beat Nicole home, and she's going to be home at 8:30. So if that phone call was made at 8:24, you would have to still been there, correct? Again, that's possible. You could have been there until 8:30, is that correct? I could have. I don't think it was that late, like I said, just because of the urgency. When you were leaving the residence that night, didn't you tell the police that you saw someone with their dog over in the dog park? I want to say I don't think so, but my confusion there would be because I knew that my friend Todd was at the park after I had left the house. After I left the house. The defense argued that Todd Jackson's in the park. Here's, the dog is looking towards the house and alerting on the house, and that must have been what the murder was. Well, we know that Mark Durban's testimony, which is credible, he says Todd was there after he had already left. That's Todd Jackson's. That's Mark Durban's testimony. Todd showed up after Durban had left. Some of the defense claims, we heard yesterday from Mr. Nardoni. There's no eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses, that's direct evidence. I saw Michael Gargiulo stab Ashley Ellerin. That's an example of direct evidence. We don't have that. He's too sly for that. We have circumstantial evidence, which is equally as powerful. So eyewitnesses are against Gargiulo's scheme and are not necessary to prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt. We heard, well, there's no physical evidence. Well, what about the blood drops on the left side of the shoe prints? Isn't that physical evidence? Remember the blood drops that go down the hallway? We have Ashley's body on the landing, and then we have blood drops going down the hallway, and they're on the left side. And we know beyond any doubt that Mr. Gargiulo's left-handed, which he tried to lie about at the beginning, but we know he's left-handed. Those blood drops along the left side of the shoe prints shows the killer's left-handed. That's physical evidence. Does that matter? The defense ignored that yesterday. That's physical evidence, and that's evidence we got from Steve Schliebe. What about the attempt to take Ashley's right breast? Is that physical evidence? Let's look at it. You may recall that I asked Dr. Ortiz a lot of questions about this injury to Ashley Ellerin's right breast. Where was it located? What direction was it in? How was it oriented around her breast? And if you look at that, and Dr. Ortiz testified to it, and you can look at it with your own common sense, and you can see that the way that injury was caused. That injury was caused by poking with a knife and starting to work its way around the perimeter of the breast.
Interpretation, this is what he's arguing overruled. Thank you.
What you're looking at on the left-hand side is part of Mr. Gargiulo's signature. He went for Ashley Ellerin's breast, and for whatever reason, he abandoned this. Maybe he was spooked by Todd Jackson in the park. That house is open, well lit, friends coming and going at all times of the day and night. He ran out of time. I submit to you that if Mr. Gargiulo would have had more time with Ashley Ellerin and not the time pressure that he had to get out of there, that he may have done the same thing to Ashley Ellerin that he did to Maria Bruno. What we're looking at here is a very distinctive injury. It is an injury to the breast that is obviously intended to start taking that breast, if you look at the location and the way that it was caused. You can see that. And then on the right side, of course, is Maria Bruno. And the reason Maria Bruno was so mutilated in the condition she was is Mr. Gargiulo had time. He had hours with her. He knew. So he had more time with Maria Bruno than he did with Ashley Ellerin. But you can look at this as a very, very distinctive feature here. And it's part of Mr. Gargiulo's signature. Very unique, distinctive feature here. That's physical evidence. The defense didn't tell you about this. In fact, Tricia, Ashley, and Maria all had breast injuries. If you look at the photographs of Tricia, she also, on the left side of her breast, had injuries. So there are breast attacks here that also tie this case together. Let's talk about Tricia. Mr. Nardoni didn't spend a lot of time on Tricia Picaccio yesterday, but let's touch some of the points here now. Mr. Nardoni was making the argument that Gargiulo's DNA was transferred via clothing. Somehow, Tricia had been in Mr. Gargiulo's van earlier in the day and then went home and changed her clothes. And I couldn't quite follow his whole argument, but what he's saying is that the DNA was transferred somehow later off of Tricia's clothes. Well, first of all, we didn't hear any evidence of that. It's pure speculation, and I don't think that Mr. Nardoni even completed his argument on this point, but they're trying to argue that there was transfer from the DNA, that Tricia picked up DNA from Gargiulo's van, went home, bathed, touched her dirty clothes again, and then went out and somehow got DNA on her hands like that. It's a bizarre, convoluted theory that makes no sense. He did comment on Timmy Leary and Anthony D. Lorenzo. They are not the key to this case. They are simply, they corroborate all the other evidence. That's their function in this case. They corroborate Mr. Gargiulo is responsible for the Picaccio murder because he bragged about it to these two men. And again, we have the concept that we dealt with a lot in the Tricia Picaccio case is the idea of casual transfer of DNA. I can touch this podium and I can get it, or shake your hand, or touch the bar, or touch this chair, and all of a sudden it's all over our hands. Well, that may or may not occur, but what we do know, logically, and your common sense is, and Mr. Dameron showed you the slide the other day, but it's worth repeating again. Tricia Picaccio leaves her house and goes out all night long, and we know she's touchy and feely. She's been out with her friends. She's hugging. She's kissing. She's touching. If there's any truth to this casual transfer of DNA theory, or I can just touch anything and get your DNA on me at all times, and we just have a cesspool of DNA around us all the time, and we're constantly transferring. If that's true, and I think the defense may be arguing that, then you would expect to find DNA from whoever Tricia touched that night, including all the people you're looking on the screen. Isn't that the logic? Well, I'm out, I'm shaking hands with everybody in this courtroom and touching everything, and then later on you test my hands. You would expect to find, I would have 75 DNA profiles on my hands. We didn't, because casual transfer of DNA doesn't work like that. The DNA expert in the Picaccio case said that in order to transfer DNA like that, it takes substantial physical contact. It doesn't just happen. Substantial physical contact. So if DNA just kind of gets transferred all the time, really super easy, well then you would expect to find all of those people with DNA on Tricia's hands or fingernails. But you didn't. What we got left with were two profiles on her fingernails. Tricia and Michael Gargiulo. That's it. So the logical conclusion is it was Mr. Gargiulo who murdered Tricia Picaccio. And there was so much physical force there, Tricia trying to save her own life. She got him. She got him somewhere. She scratched him on an eyeball, in the mouth, somewhere, got the DNA on there. Those are the only DNA profiles on Tricia Picacchio's fingernails. And this DNA profile is corroborated by the witnesses who said that Gargiulo bragged about these murders, or this murder, and it's corroborated by all the other evidence in the case, including geographical proximity. Let's talk about uncharged offenses. We had a lot of testimony on Tricia Picacchio. A lot of testimony, I think over 20 witnesses just on that case alone. How do we use that evidence? And that's from the jury instruction. This is part of it. You'll have the whole thing in the jury room. Jury instruction 375, how do you use this evidence? How are you allowed to use it? You can use it in a limited way, but basically it says if you decide the defendant committed the uncharged offense, which is the Picacchio murder, you may but are not required to consider that evidence for the limited purpose of deciding whether the defendant was the person who committed the offenses charged in this case. Gargiulo's commission of the Picacchio murder corroborates and identifies him as a perpetrator in all the charged offenses. This is an evidentiary tool that's been given to you to show that he has committed all of these offenses. That's why you heard about the Picacchio case. Maria Bruno, let's turn to that now. Mr. Nardoni talked about it yesterday. Okay, we're back to the same issue again. The defense is saying that Irving Bruno murdered Maria. That's the issue, okay? So let's go through the evidence and look at that. What do we know? What does our common sense tell us? What have we learned in this case about Irving Bruno? Let's start with this. Right after Irving had sex with Maria, she was murdered. Right after Mark Durban had sex with Ashley, she was murdered. Coincidence? No. Perfect timing? Yes. That's Gargiulo's diabolical plan at work. You just got into the mind of a serial killer. He's watching, he's waiting for the opportune moment to get in there and kill, and look what just happened. I know she lives alone. I just saw the husband leave. When they showed up, they were making a ruckus and laughing in that very quiet courtyard area. That alerts people. Mr. Gargiulo, oh, look what's going on over there. Let's watch, let's wait. I know she lives alone. I know there's no dogs in there, no boyfriend, no kids. She's there alone. And look at that. Look at that. That man just left. She's in there alone. And he's in, like that. Take a walk through the mind of a serial killer for a minute. That's how Mr. Gargiulo works. So this is Gargiulo's murder plan. Manipulate, wait, watch, sneak, pounce, kill, and misdirect. Perfect timing. Perfect timing. Because he's watching. Because he's a boy next door killer. It's no coincidence that he's living right near all these victims. He needs to watch. He needs to wait. He needs to figure it out, see what your patterns are, know when the perfect opportunity is to kill. That's what he's doing. These are the nuances of the circumstantial evidence in this case. Let's talk more about Irving Bruno. What we know about him. Again, he testified for hours over several days, and you had the opportunity to watch him. And the defense scored no points with him again than to make him cry. Another man who, you can imagine, or we can imagine being accused of murder, how Mr. Bruno must feel, and Mr. Durban. But what we know from the evidence, let's step back. Maria Bruno's apartment was a bloodbath. The photographs are unwatchable, almost. I know we have to look at them. It's a bloodbath in there. If Mr. Bruno had done this, wouldn't you expect to find blood all over the inside of his car? Wouldn't you expect that? Isn't that what your logic tells you? I mean, the killer of Maria Bruno has got to be a bloody mess. If Mr. Bruno would have murdered his wife and he would have gotten into the car, and I think the defense is saying he was blacked out and not thinking, there would have been blood all over that car, all over that car, all over the driver's side of the car, the outside of the car, the steering wheel. Didn't see it. Steve Schleby testified to that. There'd be blood all over that car. It's not there. There's no blood all over his clothes. You've got some snapshots of videotape of when he got home. His clothing was seized. His clothing was tested. He wore some of the same clothing back the next morning. There's no blood there. Is the defense suggesting that Irving Bruno mutilated his wife and by some miracle didn't get blood all over the car? Blood all over his clothes? Does that make sense? Is that logical to you? It's not. It's a stretch. And it's not a reasonable interpretation of the evidence. We know that Mr. Bruno arrived home perfectly normal and took his son to bed. You'll have snapshots from the video of that. He says hi to the maid and gets his son and he's off to bed. Nothing unusual at all about that. They're suggesting that he just mutilated his wife. It doesn't appear to be blacked out or anything. He's just taken his son to bed. You've got that in evidence. He was totally cooperative with the police, never arrested for murdering Maria. We heard from Chris Raleigh, who is the manager at Carmine's. Per Chris Raleigh, Irving and Maria got along fine at the restaurant. There was no issue, no fight between them or anything like that. Maria was hammered, we know that, but there were no issues there between them. Irving was not intoxicated and drove Maria away. There was no issue there. With regard to the blood in the car, not consistent with the bloodbath at the crime scene and consistent with either Maria smashing her finger in the door at Carmine's, which we know we've got an independent witness. Chris Raleigh came in and said she was hammered. She went to the ladies' room. She smashed her finger in the door. And sure enough, in the autopsy photos, she has her left ring finger's got an injury on it, which is consistent, if you remember where the blood is if you sit in the passenger seat of Mr. Bruno's Armada, the blood's right here on the left-hand side, which is consistent with her left hand being in contact with that hat in the console right there on a few drops of blood. That's consistent. That's consistent. That's the explanation for that blood. We can also add that Maria was menstruating and she may have touched herself, and that's corroborated by the evidence. We heard from the detectives that there was a used tampon in the trash can in the bathroom. So that's another possible source of blood for what's in the car. Mr. Bruno was interrogated for hours and constantly and consistently denied killing Maria. He was planning for the holidays with Maria and the children. He had no gain whatsoever in harming the mother of his 4 children. He was helping Maria with finances. How did the police, again, back to this idea, when you're opening yourself up to somebody, you're opening yourself up to the police, you're potentially incriminating yourself. You're opening your heart and soul to the most intimate details of your life. Stuff that we would all be mortified if we had to testify to this stuff in front of the general public or the police, and you admit those tough things. Isn't that the mark of credibility? All of us, we work with people, we have our families and our personal lives, and we work with people, and you're like, how do you know when someone's telling the truth? How do you know that? Well, you know it when you see it, you know it when you feel it. And you know it when somebody admits something difficult to admit or concedes something, like I did something bad or there's something embarrassing that I did, you admit that. Isn't that when you feel it? You feel it in your heart and soul that this person's telling me the truth. That's, jurors, you're allowed to consider these things when you're assessing the character and quality of somebody's testimony. It's like, hey, you admit bad things? That's a mark of credibility, isn't it? That's something that you can use. And look what Mr. Bruno told us about. My goodness. How did the police know about the intimate details of Irving and Maria's sex life? They have some very personal details about swinging and things like that in there. Mr. Bruno told the police about that. How in the world are the police going to know what's going on in their personal lives when personal, intimate, sexual lives? How are they going to know that? Irving told them. Irving told them. He opened himself up to them and said, hey, we're into these things. He told them about that. Irving told them. He told police things they could have never gotten. How did the police know about Irving and Maria's financing? He told them, here's what's going on, here's how much money I make, here's what's going on with our finances, she's running up the bills, things like that. That's Irving. That's Irving telling you the truth. That's Irving telling the police the truth. That's Irving opening himself up, trying to help the investigation. How did the police know about the chronology of the events the night Maria was murdered? Irving told them. Where'd you go? When did you leave? Where did you go from there? What were you doing earlier on in the day? You went to speech therapy, you met here, you went shopping, you had breakfast. We went out, we went to Carmine's, we went back. The entire chronology that night is built by Herman Bruno. He opened himself up and gave you wildly specific details. Another reason when you know someone's telling you the truth, when they're giving you very specific details about things, they're telling the truth and they have total recall. And that's what he did. How do police know about the 2 domestic violence incidents with Maria and Irving? Irving told them. That's a tough thing to admit. That's a bad thing to admit. We have 2 incidents over a 9-year period where Irving had domestic violence altercations with Maria. He did. The first time, the police showed up and said, hey, you 2 guys just go your own separate way. So the detectives didn't know about that. That's just the police showing up and say, hey, you 2, break it up. That's it. The second one, he punched her. I think the defense said that it was a 9-year abusive relationship. I think that's an overstatement. I don't think that's what happened. I think there were 2 incidents in 9 years, and Irving admitted to them both. And he hit her, and he did. And the defense is trying to parlay that into motive to kill. How do we know this? How do we know these domestic violence incidents? Irving told the police. The police would not have known about this. Detective Lilienfield would not have known about this. He told them. He's telling them bad things about his life. You're assessing his credibility. You watched him. That's a really bad thing to admit. It's a terrible thing to admit. And he admitted it because he's being honest. He didn't have to admit that. He did. How embarrassing for him. How humiliating for him. But he had told you about it. He told you about it here, and he told you the detectives about it. Again, it's the mark of somebody being honest, admitting a bad thing that you did. How did the police get access to Irving's residence? He consented. Look at his level of cooperation. How did police get access to his vehicle to search? He consented. How did the police get access to his parents' business to search? Irving consented. How did police get Irving's DNA? He consented. Unlike Mr. Gargiulo, tried to get his DNA and he ran down Clark Avenue and 4 police officers had to tackle him. He voluntarily gave his DNA to the detectives. How can I help you solve this? Never asked for a lawyer. Was interrogated for hours. Hours. Never asked for a lawyer. Here's some transcripts on what Mr. Bruno, what happened after he had sex with Maria and left. I want to go back to the transcript and be very clear on what he said. He has total recall of what happened that night, and he testifies to it over and over and over. When you were done having sexual intercourse with Maria, what, if anything, happened after that? She fell asleep. She fell asleep. I got up, put some of the clothing on that I had taken off. I saw her laying there naked on the bed sleeping. I didn't want her to leave her like that, so I just covered her while she was sleeping. What did you cover her with? With the same sheet or comforter? I just pulled it up over to the other side of her. What time did you leave? Around 3 a.m. Doesn't get more direct than that. When he left Maria, he covered her up and left. But Mr. Gargiulo was watching. Did the detectives ask you if you were the one who killed Maria? He got hammered by the detectives. He got questioned to high heaven by the detectives. Did they ask you if you killed? Yes. How many times do you think they asked you that? And that's, well, like 25, 30 different times. How did you respond to them each and every time? No, 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 I didn't kill my wife. I didn't kill my wife. There's no evidence he killed his wife. During the course of your 4 or 5 interviews, this is from Detective Lilienfield now, approximately how many times did he deny killing his wife? At least 20. During the course of your 4 to 5 interviews, how many times did he admit to killing his wife? Never. Did he ever ask for a lawyer? No. Did you ever place him under arrest for murder? No. There's no evidence to do that. All the evidence points to Mr. Gargiulo. Mr. Bruno, had sex with his wife that night and left, and Mr. Gargiulo slipped right on behind him and mutilated Maria. That's the circumstantial evidence. Cross-examined for hours, put under a microscope, answered personal details of his life and Maria's life with total honesty, and was responsive and consistent in all of his answers. Let's talk about Robert Rasmussen. Robert Rasmussen is the gentleman who lives across the pool, so across from Maria on the first level. And he testified, and yesterday, if I caught it correctly, I think Mr. Nardoni argued that, okay, Mr. Rasmussen is saying, I'm seeing this creepy guy lurking around, and he's trying doorknobs, and he's looking in windows, and he walked into Maria's apartment and then backs out slowly, like that. And we asked Mr. Rasmussen can you identify that guy? Who is that guy? And that's when we went through a series of his identifications. And he's asked, the guy that you saw, was he a tenant? And Robert said, no, he wasn't a tenant. So we know Mr. Gargiulo's a tenant, so Robert's mistaken on that. But we know that it's still Mr. Gargiulo because of the corroboration. Let's look at that. First of all, Robert said 100% not Irving Bruno. That fact may have got lost a little bit, but what happened when the police came back to Maria's house with Irving later on that day, or may have been a day or two later, I can't remember, but they took Irving over to Maria's house to collect her personal belongings and stuff like that. And that's when Mr. Rasmussen was there, and the detectives say, hey, is this the creepy guy? And Robert said, 100%, no, that's not him. So Irving's exonerated from Rasmussen. He's like, that's not the guy I saw lurking around and creeping around the apartment. That's what Mr. Rasmussen said, 100% certain of that. Then he does the composite drawing of the guy that he saw, and that's spot on with Mr. Gargiulo. We've already looked at that. Mr. Dameron showed you that. He gives an accurate physical description of Gargiulo, spot on. Gargiulo has a black hat, just like Robert described when we looked at the composite. It's a black hat. Gargiulo's got a black hat. We'll look at that. And then Mr. Gargiulo, for good measure, admits in the Perkins operation that it's him. So even though Robert Rasmussen is like, the guy I saw wasn't a tenant, Robert's mistaken about that. But all the other evidence corroborates it's an accurate identification. And this is Mr. Gargiulo. On the left is the composite, which is remarkably similar to Mr. Gargiulo. On the right is a photograph of Mr. Gargiulo and his wife, Ana Luz Gonzalez, wearing a black hat. And then Mr. Gargiulo in the Perkins operation says, the witness had seen me go in there. Well, of course that's true. Well, of course that's true. So that's true. So Mr. Rasmussen makes an accurate identification. He's just mistaken about whether Gargiulo is a tenant or not. Mr. Nardoni made a comment yesterday about Maria Bruno. He said, that attack was personal. You bet it was. These are so difficult to look at. That attack on Maria Bruno was as personal as it gets. And look at these other attacks. Look at Tricia. Look at Ashley. Look at Michelle. Stabbing somebody with a knife multiple times is as personal as it gets. So I don't think that you can look at the evidence in isolation and go, oh, Maria Bruno, that's such a personal attack. It must be her husband. It must be Herman Bruno. It was so personal to him. Look at the other victims and how personal that was, and step back and look and see how this is all similar. All very, very personal attacks, because that's the way that Mr. Gargiulo likes it. They're all very, very personal. Okay, the booty. Let's see if we can follow this with the booty. This is Rube Goldberg's invention. This is a cartoon you may have seen, and it's an old cartoon. And basically, what Rube Goldberg's invention is there has to be this wacky machination of events in order to make something happen. So it's known as Rube Goldberg's invention. And what it basically means is, it's a tortured explanation for simple facts. You go through all these machinations to get to something that's very simple. And that's what we did, and that's what Mr. Nardoni did, actually, with the booty. Okay, we've got a blue booty outside the apartment that has Mr. Gargiulo's DNA on it and Maria's blood. Let's look at this. First of all, let's be clear on the chronology that occurred the morning that Mr. Bruno comes back and finds Maria mutilated in her bed. Okay, we need to have that chronology in mind because we want to talk about the screen and we want to talk about the booty. okay? And what we know is, first of all, at 6 a.m., Barbara Schwanenberg saw the blue booty on the ground. She comes out to get her paper. Barbara lived right next door to Maria. She comes out to get the paper. There's the blue booty at 6 a.m. So the booty's on the ground at 6 a.m. Bruno's at home at this point, okay? At 7:20, neighbor Maru Tarkeshi saw the screen in the planter box. So at 6 a.m., the booty's there. At 7:20, the screen is there. Irving departs his residence in Arcadia to drive back to Maria's residence. You're going to have video surveillance in evidence with the snapshots from the video, and when you do the time is off on it. You'll get that in the test. It's about 50 minutes slow, I believe, but you can do the math and figure it out. It's about 7:45 a.m. is when Irving leaves the house, backs out of his driveway, and goes back to drive back to take Maria her cell phone and to pick her up and take her back to her car because she'd been drinking. So it's about 7:45-ish when Irving leaves his residence, Arcadia, to drive back to Maria's residence, which is about a 15-minute drive or so. Irving arrives at Maria's apartment and calls 911, and 10 minutes later, and then the police arrive at approximately 8:19. So that's our basic chronology. So when Irving gets there, the screen's already there, and the booty's already there. And then that's when he's knocking and pounding and making a ruckus and goes through the window and finds Maria's body. So what we have is, I think what we have is the defense saying Irving Bruno murdered his wife. And then, to make it look like somebody else did it, he put the screen over there, and then put the booty over there, and then somehow got blood on it. You see how that doesn't connect? That's hard to follow. It's a ridiculous defense claim. And then Irving shows up the next morning and pounds on the door, goes to the window. None of this adds up. So the Rube invention, let's look at how the defense is trying desperately to explain how Maria's blood gets on that booty. Step by step. This is the Rube invention. These are all the assumptions that you have to make to try to get to this unreasonable conclusion about how the blood got on the booty. First of all, we know it's Gargiulo's booty with his DNA on it. The defense conceded that. And they said Gargiulo dropped it, but you've been there. You've stood in front of Mr. Gargiulo's apartment. You've stood in front of Maria's apartment. That booty is pretty much right in front of Maria's door on the other side. They're saying, oh, we dropped it. What in the world? That doesn't make sense. What in the world is Mr. Gargiulo doing over there on that side of the apartment? It doesn't make sense to be dropped in that particular location. It doesn't make sense. The stains around the booty were blood. Not true. Mr. Nardoni made the point yesterday. There's some drops that when you look at the close-up of the booty, there's some drops from, oh, that's blood. So there's someone bloody, dripping blood on the booty. Well, let's look at that closer. It's not blood, and Steve Schleve looked at it and said, it's not blood. I didn't test it. It's clearly not blood. The next is Bruno dripped blood on the booty. Well, they're not drops, they're smears. And we're going to look at that in a minute, too. So we don't have a bunch of blood dripping around over there. We don't have drops, we have smears. So none of this is adding up. The booty's inside out. Mr. Nardoni made the point that there was blood inside of the booty, or the booty's inside out. Well, that's consistent with having a bloody hand and sticking your hand inside you can get blood inside the booty, obviously. That's common sense. And taking the booty off. That would explain depositing blood inside the booty. Mr. Nardoni said there was not enough blood on the booty. With as much blood as there was in Maria's apartment, if that booty would have been inside the apartment and used during the attack, there would have been a lot more blood on it. Well, what do we know? It took time for Maria to get that bloody broken. It takes time to bleed out the way she did. And we know from Michelle Murphy what Mr. Gargiulo does when he attacks. Up on the bed like this. Knee up on the bed, stabbing. So necessarily one of his feet is going to be out of the way and probably not in a pool of blood in front of him, which explains that. We know that. That's how he gets in position to kill. We know that from Michelle Murphy. So his knee was up on the bed. He wouldn't get as much blood on that boot. It's a theory. This is the booty. Mr. Nardoni's arguing that all these, or the spots around here are blood. Steve Schliebe said it's not blood. And you can see there's so many stains here, it almost looks like somebody had a wet garbage bag or something to drag a garbage bag out or something. But you can see there's stains all over the place in here. So when Schliebe went out there and assessed this, he's like, that's not blood. That's not blood there. It's not even testable for blood. So the defense theory is not holding water at all and makes no sense. And it's totally unreasonable. Here's the booty. This is a little bit overexposed here, but we've got basically 3 areas on the booty, and they're not drops. And you'll have these back in the jury room. You can look at them closer. They're not, we know what a drop of blood looks like. These are smudges. These are smears. This is consistent with Gargiulo taking a bloody hand and taking off his booty. So they're not drops, walking along and dropping a blood drop. These are smudges or smears. You can see it with your own eyes. Defense claims. The defense is, I think, saying that Mr. Bruno blacked out and killed his wife. I think that might be one of the claims. Well, what Mr. Bruno says is that's taken out of context. Chris Raleigh verifies Irving was sober. Irving recalls how he left Maria. He blanked out. He was being interrogated over hours and hours and hours and being asked really super specific questions, and he couldn't remember anything. And he's being super helpful, and there were questions like, do you remember if you locked the door behind you? And he's like, I can't remember. I may have blanked out on that. That gets parlayed now into this guy blacked out and murdered his wife. Blown way out of proportion. You saw Irving's like, that's taken out of context. I didn't blank out. I've got total recall. I know what happened that night. There might be specific details I don't remember, but I didn't black out. And by the way, side note, if he blacked out, how did he find his way back to Maria's in the morning? First of all, how did he come up with this elaborate scheme to put the screen over there and put the booty over there and go back and forth? And by the way, the booty over there is not in the direction of where his car's parked over there. That doesn't make any sense. And then he finds his way back in the morning. It's the first time he'd ever been to Maria's park. So he's obviously got total recall. He's not blacked out. He finds his way back in the morning. When Irving comes back in the morning, interesting note, Irving pounded on Maria's door, drew attention from the neighbors, and crawled through the window to check on her and then called 911. Here's what we know. Here's what we know from our common sense. Killers like Mr. Gargiulo run away. Don't we have all the evidence in the world of that? We know what he did to Michelle Murphy. Brutally stabbed her and ran away. That's what killers do. That's what Gargiulo does. He flees, he runs. He commits cowardly attacks on completely vulnerable women and then runs away. That's him. You don't run back to crime scenes and then make yourself a target of the investigation, which is Irving Bruno. Irving Bruno comes in the next day. He's beating on the door. The neighbors are coming out. You've got the 911 call. You can hear the background noise. The neighbors are confronting him. What are you doing, man? Why are you beating on that door? Why are you going to that window? I mean, he's like, my wife's not coming to the door. And then he goes to the window. So killers run away from crime scenes. Innocent men go back and help, which is what Mr. Bruno did. Michelle Murphy. The defense concedes Gargiulo attacked Michelle Murphy. Mr. Nardoni did not ask you to find Mr. Gargiulo not guilty of the Murphy attack and attempted escape. When he finished yesterday, he did not ask you to do that. Interesting. Mr. Rubin talked more about Michelle Murphy. He conceded, bombshell, he conceded defendant Gargiulo was at her house and committed the attack. That was the concession that you got yesterday. And I think we heard Mr. Gargiulo woke up in the middle of the attack and ran away saying, I'm sorry. He was a little kid again fighting monsters. Who's the monster? Michelle Murphy, asleep in her bed. She's the monster being fought. Who's the monster in this equation? This is horrific. This is a complete fabrication. Little kid fighting monsters, let's go through the facts. When we're talking about little kids fighting monsters, we need to talk about planning, we need to talk about goal-directed behavior, we need to talk about what you're thinking, what you're doing, what your behavior was before, during, and after. These are pieces of evidence, circumstantial evidence that tell us what's going on in your mind and what's going on whether you're mentally sound or not. Let's look at what happened. Let's look at the evidence. Let's walk through it. Let's go through what we know. Mr. Gargiulo, first of all, chose a woman he wanted to get with. He waited until 11:30 p.m. Again, he's waiting for the perfect opportunity to kill. He's not committing crimes in front of a bunch of people. He's not running down Wilshire Boulevard with a bloody knife and attacking people in front of the cops. Perfect opportunity to kill. Doesn't that speak volumes to you? If you're sleepwalking or disassociating or whatever you're doing, don't you you get triggered, you do it right here in this courtroom, potentially, right? Or perfect opportunity to kill. You want to get inside the mind of a serial killer? Look how perfectly he times these attacks. Really, really powerful evidence. Uncanny timing. Gargiulo waited until the roommate and boyfriend were gone. Real-time intelligence. He's watching, he's waiting. Gargiulo waited until Michelle went to bed. Gargiulo grabbed the knife, climbed on the rail, cut the screen, silently entered and walked to Michelle's bedroom, attacked Michelle, stopped when Michelle kicked him off. Gargiulo then ran off. Flight is a real big one. You hurt somebody and you run away, flight equals guilt. Flight knows you knew what you did. Sometimes people commit violent crimes and the cops get they're still there because they really have a mental problem and they don't know what they've done and they think they're walking in circles or something.
I'm going to object, Your Honor, this misstates the evidence. In fact, there is no evidence.
He's just quoting, it's just like a thing. It's just a common occurrence, so I'm going to allow it to stand.
Gargiulo got rid of the weapon and the clothing. He hid his vans. He told Dr. Castellano not to pull the medical records. You know, he's in a fugue state. He does not apologize when kicked off. He does so on the way out the door. Mr. Rubin said, oh, he wakes up and there was a fog and now I'm sorry. No, he does so. He's on the way out the door already when he's saying he's sorry. And that's because he knows he's busted. He knows he cut himself. He's like already working on his defense. Oh, I'm sorry. What's he apologizing for? I thought he blacked out. Sorry. I thought he just woke up. So what's he apologizing for? See, it doesn't make sense. It's not a reasonable interpretation of the evidence. If just coming out of the state, why not stop? Hey, where am I? What am I doing here? Oh my God, what have I done? I've done something terrible. Can I help you? I've done something terrible. Let me call 911. Was Gargiulo in a fugue state when he victimized all the other people that we heard about in this case? When we were doing the analysis of antisocial personality disorder? He was always in a fugue state? No, that's not a reasonable conclusion. The defense calls Sergeant Alfred a liar. Let's turn to that. Why is that such a big deal? Mr. Rubin called Sergeant Alfred a liar yesterday. Let's talk about that. This is Sergeant Alfred doing a reenactment with Detective Lillianfield in the jail, reenacting the way that she found Dr. Castellano with Mr. Gargiulo. What do we know? The defense said it never happened. The defense claims Gargiulo was always put in the same interview. Not true. We'll see that transcript. Why is the defense so desperate to call Sergeant Alfred a liar? And Sergeant Alfred did report the incident. She reported it to her legal department. This is the reenactment. Here's what we know from Sergeant Alfred. And a big deal was made out of which room Mr. Gargiulo was put in. I'll walk you through it very quickly. On every other occasion that Dr. Castellano saw Mr. Gargiulo, it would have been in this room. I can't be certain, just as far as your recollection, he was in the other room too. This is Alfred saying he goes into either room. He goes into either room, okay? And on every other occasion that Dr. Castellano saw Mr. Gargiulo, it would have been in this room that's on the board right now. I can't be certain, just as far as your recollection. He was in the other room too. It could have been either or. Was this a memorable event for you? You bet it was. Yes, I actually conduct briefings on it now, and she tells you about how this was so memorable. She now trains other deputies on that. That's how memorable it was for her. This happened. Dr. Castellano was in that room with Mr. Gargiulo in a compromising position, and what does that tell you? They're in cahoots with each other, she's totally biased, and she lied about it. If you decide that a witness deliberately lied about something significant in this case, you should consider not believing anything that witness says. She lied about what she did with Mr. Gargiulo in that room. She lied about it. Sergeant Alford has no dog in this fight. Sergeant Alford saw something. it was totally memorable to her. It's like, wow, we're in a jail facility here, and this guy's special handle, and she's around the other side of the table in a position like that with him. That's a big whoop. That's a big whoop to deputies like that. And she reported it. And it tells you volumes about Dr. Costello. Dr. Shug. Dr. Shug talks about goal-directed behavior. Let's run through this, and then I think I'm going to be able to be done by noon, hopefully. Let's talk about goal-directed behavior. Here's what Dr. Shug says. Other than antisocial personality disorder, did you find any credible evidence of a mental defect the defendant suffered at the time of the charged crime? I did not. Would someone with antisocial personality disorder, would someone having antisocial personality disorder, would that affect their ability to plan and commit crimes? I would argue it would make it easier for them to do that. He's a sociopath, antisocial personality disorder, no remorse, easy for him to hurt people. Well, if they already have a personality style that's geared towards disobeying rules and law, lacking remorse, and being deceitful, all of these things factor into someone who could readily commit crimes and plan and carry them out. Is that correct? Yes, that's Dr. Shug. So, what I ended up with in my conclusion, and with my opinion, is that there was not enough evidence to meet the criteria for dissociative identity disorder. I also thought that there was enough evidence to meet diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder. And that was something that Dr. Budding had indicated in her report that needed to be ruled out. Is that correct? Yes. And did you see any mention of antisocial personality disorder in Dr. Castellano's report? No, she didn't even mention the rule out, which I thought was unusual. I don't think we need to talk a whole lot more about Dr. Castellano. Totally biased, sharing confidential memos with the defense, working for the defense, paid over $300,000, in cahoots with Gargiulo, trying to come up with this DID diagnosis, which is extremely rare and contrary to the evidence. Do we need to talk a whole lot more about her? She's completely biased and unbelievable, and she lied to you. Dr. Castellano didn't even consider Gargiulo's prior criminality. I wonder why. We went through all of those. I think there were over 20 incidents of prior criminality, which is an element of antisocial personality disorder. That's why you heard that evidence, because it's part of the diagnosis. When you're trying to diagnose somebody, you look at what they've done. You look at their history, their prior crimes. It's critical. She did none of that. Why? Because she doesn't want him to have antisocial personality disorder. She wants him to be a sleepwalker or have DID. She's slamming him in that box over there, ignoring all that evidence. She ignored that evidence right here in front of you. She ignored all that evidence. Totally biased. And somebody who has a disorder like antisocial personality disorder, can they be trusted as reliable resource in forming an opinion and diagnosing that same person with dissociative identity disorder? One of the possible symptoms of antisocial personality disorder is deceitfulness, lying, and if that particular trait is present in the disorder, you would have a difficult time trusting them with any information. It's not to say that they're not capable of telling the truth, but you would have to definitely verify. You can't believe a word he says, and we know that. Lie, lie, lie until you die. Dr. Castellano is relying on Mr. Gargiulo, and he's a colossal liar. He's admitted it. Would evidence of goal-directed behavior, however, tend to be an indicator that somebody is making conscious, volitional decisions? I would say yes. Someone apologizing to a victim of a violent attack immediately after the attack, could that be an indicator the person is making conscious, volitional decisions? Yes. When you say what we know about the defendant, refresh your memory what you're speaking of. In terms of all the information we've gotten about his deceitfulness and his wanting to be an actor at one point and sort of dramatic character, that it's possible that he also could have been sort of play acting or, doing something else that was not related to disassociation. And we're referring now to when he was doing that thing in the jail where he was cut up behind and doing the acting in the jail. Well, what he was doing, he had done that earlier in the day with Detective Duncan. He's just repeating it. So we're asking Dr. Shug about it here. He could have been acting something out, could have. Could have been fantasizing, could have. Remembering something he had done, possibly. So he's not disassociating. He could be doing any number of things. What he's doing, though, is trying to figure out the evidence. The way that he did earlier with Duncan, he's trying to figure out how the stab wounds could be left or right. He's acting that out again. It's the reasonable interpretation of what Mr. Gargiulo was doing in the cell. or he's fantasizing about the way that he murdered Ashley Ellerin, because what he demonstrated was basically the way that Ashley Ellerin was probably killed. Dr. Shug was reviewing the transcript and reading about an incident back to the acting out in the jail. And in this particular incident, you recall reading about how he asked Detective Duncan to move out of the way of the camera. This was the first incident where he's demonstrating. He says, hey, come over here. He flushes the toilet and he gets out of the way of the camera. And he's reenacting how to stab somebody. He started flushing the toilet, correct, and talked his way through a demonstration of using a knife. Yes, would you say, based on those factors, that during this incident the defendant was not in a dissociative state? I would say that's what it suggests, yes. He's not in a dissociative state. He's acting out the evidence, is what he's doing. He's using those detectives as kind of a focus group, and he's running through all the evidence to see what his options are, because he's planning his defense for you. Goal-directed behavior. We're going to run through these pretty quickly. No, Your Honor, I have 30 more slides.
Why don't you finish this up? Why don't we take a break, and you'll finish this afternoon. I'll instruct as soon as you're done. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, keep in mind the admonition 1:30 this afternoon. Thank you.